All right, welcome back. Finishing up Unit 5 here with the Harlem Renaissance, talking about black artists in New York, generally considered to have started in about 1918, and this period continues on into the 1930s. So we're not officially in the 1930s in our sort of history study yet, but we're going to talk about a little bit. We're going to kind of bend our timeline just a little bit for this. So today we're going to hit on Harlem itself. Where is it? What is it? When was it? The visual, written, and musical traditions that come from this time period and the artists of this time period. And then we're going to take a look at sort of the legacy of the Harlem Renaissance. So, make sure I have my keyboard close by. Okay. So Harlem itself is a neighborhood in Manhattan, in New York City. So it's a very specific place, just to the north of Central Park. This neighborhood is majority black, eventually becoming a center for black culture, music, and literature. This was originally the only place in the city that black people could find housing, so they were forced into that. One of the only places. There were a few places. New York's a big enough city, they had a few different places. But it was one of the places in New York City that black people were basically forced to live if they wanted to live anywhere in the city. And they came together and produced just an amazing amount of culture for such a short time frame. So this started shortly after World War I, and it goes into, like I said, about the 1930s. And this just became this like maelstrom of just creative output. Writers, visual artists, musicians. Not a lot of other points in history when you can point back to about a decade or two where so many new types of art were coming out at just a prodigious rate. And obviously, it helped if you had a little bit of money. So here are some women in Harlem from around that time period. Very, very good coats. For those of you in Texas, when it gets cold, even your coats need to be super warm and stylish because that's all anyone's going to see. So let's start with the visual art. I'm going to take a look at the visual arts of the Harlem Renaissance. Now, obviously, there are going to be a ton of artists I have to leave out of this. We do not have an entire semester to study just the Harlem Renaissance. That would be easy to do. There's so much that happened in such a short time period. You could easily take an entire college class just on the Harlem Renaissance, and it's what led to it, what made it, how it became a thing, and the legacy that it still leaves. Because, like I mentioned earlier, one of my grandmothers was born in 1918, so this whole thing, this whole time period we're talking about today, is within living memory. There are people that are alive today that were alive during this. And there are a lot of people alive today that have spoken directly to people that were a part of this. So, history is not that long ago, folks. Remember that. The first one here is Josephine Baker. Hard to do a history on the Harlem Renaissance and not mention Josephine Baker. But it's also really hard to do a history on the Harlem Renaissance and skip over a lot of the artists I had to skip over. So, honestly, if this is stuff that's interesting to you, look up more actors, more dancers, more painters, more authors. There is so much out there, and I can only cover the tiniest bit of it in the time that we have, because I don't have an entire semester or even an entire month to go over this. But she was mostly an actress and also a dancer. And for a lot of these people, I wanted to let them tell you in their own words who they were, what they believed. Because we don't usually get a ton of black voices in American history. We get a lot of people talking about black people. And sometimes we get black voices in U.S. history classes. Martin Luther King Jr. is obviously an example. And obviously we should hear from Martin Luther King Jr., but we should hear about a few others too. So for most of these people, I kind of let them speak for themselves if I could find, good quotes and good writing from them, which usually wasn't hard, honestly. So Josephine Baker, I think this particular quote comes from a little bit later in her life, because she lived until 1975. She lived to see Martin Luther King Jr. get assassinated. I mean, she got to see his whole rise and everything else, and also got to see him assassinated. Surely the day will come when color means nothing more than the skin tone, when religion is seen uniquely as a way to speak to one's soul, when birthplaces have the weight of a throw of the dice, and all men are born free, when understanding breeds love and brotherhood. So, what she said. Fantastic actress, fantastic dancer. I'm pretty sure a lot of her movies are still out and around. So if you're interested, look her up. I'm sure she's got an IMDb page. Aaron Douglas, the father of African American art. He is a fantastic artist. Lived 1899 to 1979. So again, got to see. He was a teenager when Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois were doing their work, and he was an older man when Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X came onto the scene, and Rosa Parks and Medgar Evers and all the rest. We'll get to them. But one person is alive that entire time. Not just one, like a lot of people are, but one person could be alive for that entire stretch. And a lot of the people we're talking about today were. So they got to see sort of that whole rise and fall and rise of black civil rights. And Aaron Douglas, originally he was a landscape painter, which was very common in America. It's very, landscape painters are pretty common in a lot of places. But he kind of starts doing some more experimental art styles that are kind of coming around during this part. And not only did he start kind of experimenting with these new experimental art styles like Cubism, he started combining them with traditional African art and traditional Egyptian art. Now, obviously, Egypt is in Africa, but it kind of has its own, art style, sort of in that northern African Mediterranean area. And this is a very good example of his art. I'm a very big fan of this one. Just the colors, the shapes, the geometry of it, the obvious skill and effort and dedication put into this painting, but also, it's a journey, right? Like down here at the bottom, you have the hands reaching up, some of them still manacled, and then you have the people as they are, during the Harlem Renaissance. They've climbed higher, and they have their tools, right? Their books, their compasses, other, mathematical engineering tools. And they're moving even forward to the shining city on the hill, which is a reference to the Pilgrims. They talked about how America would be the shining city on the hill, which by itself is a biblical reference. So this stuff references very far back in our history. Very far back indeed. So, big fan of Aaron Douglas. Check out more of his artwork. I don't think you'll regret it. Fantastic artist. So, now we're up to, that's some of the visual. There's so many more. I wanted to kind of dig a little bit deeper on the individuals instead of just going, here's one, and here's one, and here's one, and here's one. But, Google Harlem Renaissance painters and you will have material for days to go digging through and looking at and appreciating and learning about. So, what about the literature? What about the writers? Some of these names are going to be kind of familiar. You've probably read some of these in English class, and if you haven't, you probably will before you're done with your senior year. Zora Neale Hurston, absolutely, is a very common read in English classes in U.S. in U.S. history, in American education. So she lived until about 1960, so she didn't see Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X assassinated, but she did kind of see the stuff start coming up, which I'm sure probably was probably a good thing to see. She was an author, yes, that's what she's best known for. She was also an anthropologist, studied ancient history before we wrote things down, so we call it anthropology. and also a filmmaker. There's a lot of her stuff is still out there. Feel free to go looking. The most famous book that she wrote was Their Eyes Were Watching God. If you've read something by Zora Neale Hurston, that's probably what you've read. If you haven't read it yet, you probably will before you graduate high school. And one thing about her is she's not the first one to do it necessarily, but she helps popularize it, she helps normalize it, continuing a tradition that goes back to, the original Martin Luther, trying to get away from the Catholic Church. She wrote how people spoke. Martin Luther, he translated the Bible into sort of that common German that everybody knew instead of keeping it in Latin. And a bunch of authors have done similar things to where they are writing for their community, for their, readership. And so she wrote in accents and dialects that, Black Americans would be familiar with, whether it's, from sort of the Deep South, from the Southeast, from the Midwest, wherever these Black communities are, they all had various, versions of these dialects and how they spoke. So she wrote the dialogue in that way. So one of the quotes from Their Eyes Were Watching God: two things everybody's got to do I can't really do the accent like at all. So I'm not going to try. Two things everybody's got to do for themselves: they got to go to God, and they got to find out about living for themselves. So, fantastic writer. Just the skill and work she put into it blows me away. And also, did other bits of art as well. Langston Hughes, incredibly influential writer. A lot of times when people talk about these artists from the Harlem Renaissance, they'll talk about how, this is an influential African-American writer, or, it's an influential African-American musician. And that's true, they are. But with a lot of these people, I would say that you could just say that they're an incredibly influential author, incredibly influential poet, incredibly influential playwright. Yes, absolutely he was Black, and absolutely that, that lived experience that he had, influenced his writing. But, he can hang with any American author as far as influence on literature, especially American literature, over the years. Again, kind of lives in that same time period a lot of these Harlem Renaissance people lived in, late 1800s, early 1900s to the 1960s or 1970s. And he's got a lot of types of artists under his belt. He was a poet, a novelist, a playwright, and an activist. And this is from one of his poems. One of many. This dude wrote a ton. And this particular excerpt is from The Negro Speaks of Rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. Fantastic imagery. Take this to your English teacher. If you're like, why is this so impressive? Why is this such good writing? They can break it down for you. It's phenomenal. Just talent. So again, tons of other writers come out of the Harlem Renaissance, but Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes are the two giants. Not to say that these other people that I didn't get to aren't talented. They absolutely are. It's just, you gotta make a cutoff somewhere. So, music and musicians. This is what most people think of when they think of the Harlem Renaissance. They think of the music. And I can't really blame them. I'm not trying to put down the visual or the written artists of this time period, but like there's something about music, right? A lot more people are going to have heard the same music than have seen the same books or read the same books or seen the same paintings. So there's something about music, and especially the music of the Harlem Renaissance. Count Basie, one of my favorite musicians, honestly. He played the piano, but he always had a big band, a big orchestra, right? And he lived 1904 to 1984, so he died when I was 2 years old. I was alive by the time this guy died. We're in the present. History is now, right? Like we're not hundreds of years ago on another continent. We're talking about America with people, some of whom were alive when I was alive. And all of them were alive when my parents were alive. Probably a lot of your parents too. If not your parents, then your grandparents. So he played the piano, fantastic piano player, but he always had that big band swing orchestra. Just such an energetic, such a good band. On the music ones, I've got YouTube videos. I'll show those in class when I'm not broadcasting out to the world. But feel free to click on the links, or just do a search for them. And hey, if you want tickets, not right now, because this year it's a pandemic, and I don't think the Count Basie Orchestra is still playing shows. They probably shouldn't be in America. They could go in like New Zealand and play. They've figured out the coronavirus. But if you're watching this a few years from now and you're like, oh yeah, we figured out that coronavirus thing. First of all, awesome. If you can come back in time and tell me how we did it so I can just do it sooner, that'd be awesome. But I get it if you can't. So yeah, the Count Basie Orchestra still plays, obviously without Count Basie himself, but the group goes on. So you can still get tickets, you can still see them touring. And man, they're so hard narrowing down the musicians for the music part of the Harlem Renaissance. Ma Rainey, the mother of the blues, her voice, you've got to look up some of her music. That video is a phenomenal one. If you don't want to watch that one, look up another one. Look up a bunch of them, add her to your playlist. You're not going to regret it. She was either born in 1882 or 1886. Hard to say. And she passed in 1939. It's one of those things, I want to play it right now, so go and pause this video. Go listen to her play, and then come back. I'll wait. All right, welcome back. Gotta hear her voice, honestly. You just have to. So, let's talk about the Cotton Club. This is a flyer advertising the Cotton Club, which has some very outdated styles of art on it. It had that sort of white performers in blackface thing. We'll get to that. The Cotton Club itself was opened by a white gangster as a speakeasy during Prohibition. Had a lot of alcohol to sell, needed a place to sell it. It was illegal to do so, so they set up a speakeasy. Now, this was one in New York City, run by, a gangster. So it was pretty much operated out in the open. It was not very well hidden that this was a speakeasy at all. But as you might have guessed from the name, it was the Cotton Club, so they made it look like a plantation, and all the black employees were dressed to look like servants, not slaves, or as African savages, which isn't great. So that was awkward. I don't know what else to say about that. Just this, every time we get into this year, it's just like, oh, why? But if you were young and white and you were wanting to go out of town and enjoy some of this new music by black artists, why you had to go down to the Cotton Club, and the people serving your drinks were dressed as house servants. And this is, but right on the other hand, a ton of black musicians played here. This is how you knew you made it in Harlem. If you got to play the Cotton Club, you were on your way up as a musical act, and it was one of the places that would actually allow black people to perform. One of the first places, honestly. And now black people couldn't come to the club, but you could perform there and you could make a little bit of money there, and that kind of had to be enough for some people. I'm trying to remember which artist it was. We'll get to that. That actually happens closer to the other civil rights movement. So what? What does it matter that the Harlem Renaissance happened, other than the fact that you've got awesome art to go watch, you've got great books and plays to go read and see, and you've got just hours and hours and hours and tons of artists to add to your playlist if that's your thing. So what? So what? What's the legacy? What happens? So immediately what happens is Americans go crazy for what they called black music. Well, that was the polite term people used. We're not going to get into the other ways people referenced it. But this new demand for this music became such a big deal. A bunch of clubs, after the Cotton Club got super successful at that, a bunch of clubs, not all around the nation, there were a lot of places this was not allowed, but anywhere a club could get away with it, they would get black musicians to come in to play jazz, to play swing, to play the blues, to play all these, new styles of music coming out of Harlem. This doesn't cure racism right away either. Like I mentioned about the Cotton Club, most of these clubs that had black musicians didn't allow black guests in the club. So a bunch of white people got to come in and watch black people. That's why they called it the Cotton Club. Okay, so a bunch of white people got to come in and enjoy themselves while black people worked. But this time they got paid, as musicians. So not great. It's a step forward, but it's still not great. And a lot of these, by the way, clubs did not allow integrated bands to play. If you were a jazz band, you could not play with white artists and black artists at the same time. The only places you could really find that were the underground speakeasies. But that's kind of where some of this stuff started. Some of that integration started in the really underground speakeasies, where it was, fine. The ones that were way out in the open, like the Cotton Club, they couldn't do that. And also, pretty immediately, these intellectual traditions, these artistic traditions, all of these, by the way, count as both intellectual and artistic traditions. There's no separation on these for those terms. It gives black Americans a distinct culture to take pride in. It's why we can talk about having a black culture in America, but there's not really a similar way to talk about a white culture in America. There's Scottish culture in America. There's, Italian culture in America. There's Scottish, Irish. I think I said one of those already. There's a lot of cultures in America based on where your family came from back in the day, and that's just talking about ethnic groups that are considered white in 2020. You can go into a ton of people. You can have Chinese culture in America, Brazilian culture in America, all kinds. But for black Americans, the way that they were treated since the beginning of this country has sort of forced that, instead of it being like a culture from Ghana in America and a culture from Egypt in America and a culture from, South Africa's sort of distinct these days. But from a lot of for a lot of African Americans, their ancestors that were brought over on slave ships, their identities were taken from them intentionally and often violently. So you end up with this sort of idea of a black culture in America. So, not calling anybody any names, but if you've ever wondered why can we have a black culture in America but not a white culture in America? Because of stuff like this. Black people were forced to live in the same neighborhood. They weren't allowed to buy or rent from anywhere else in New York. And they were treated in the same way by other groups of people based on their skin color, and basically nothing else. So this is kind of where that idea of a black culture to take pride in really explode. I mean, it existed before this, but this gives it that artistic culture, that intellectual culture, to really kind of build that identity. And the long-term legacy is kind of hard to list, so I will give you the absolute basics in the form of a very incomplete list of musical genres that came directly out of the Harlem Renaissance. Now, some of these may not have existed at the Harlem Renaissance, but you can take a look at a step or two back in their development as musical styles and go, oh, back to the Harlem Renaissance. Oh, back to this band. Oh, back to these groups. Oh, back to this club. Ragtime, jazz, blues, R&B, rock and roll, and all the types of rock and roll. Hard rock, death metal, alternative rock, indie rock, all of those. Disco, whether it's alive or dead, disco. House music, like electronic music, like that kind of music, that comes straight from the Harlem Renaissance. And hip-hop, rap, every sort of iteration of that traces its line straight back to the Harlem Renaissance. There's very few times, there's a reason why it's called the Harlem Renaissance, because the last time we had a small area produce so many artists that influenced world culture as, from such a small area, such a small time period, such a small group of people having such a huge influence on world culture, is the Italian Renaissance of the 1500s. The Ninja Turtles, Michelangelo, Donatello. Not actually Ninja Turtles, obviously, but that's the last time this happened. That's why it's called the Harlem Renaissance, because it's so hugely influential. And I don't know that there's going to come a time when we see a repeat of this. Maybe not for another 500 years. And we'll probably all be gone by then. So we probably won't live to see it. You never know. Science is wild, and humanity is nothing if not adaptable. But is this why people say don't forget to comment, and subscribe, because they don't know how else to end a video? The end. Go Harlem Renaissance. All these artists, fantastic. Look up even more if this is your deal. Watch the music. Watch the music videos. Look up your own. Look up more of those of the writers. You can keep to Zora Neale Thurston and Langston Hughes, or you can branch out. There's a ton to pick from. So have a great day. We'll see you next time. Don't forget to share, and subscribe, and ring the bell, and hit the thing, and do the other. All right, bye.